Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to Talk Like a Leader. This week's episode is titled, Consider Alternate Stories. Now, the topic of this week's episode is related to those communication situations when you're really not sure about a person's intent. And the point is to definitely beware of any negative assumptions driven by just a natural human negativity bias, where we might fill in the blanks or fill in the gaps of our understanding with negative assumptions about what the other person says or does. I find that this is a particularly true issue when we're confronted with remote and or hybrid work situations, when we don't see each other face to face for extended periods of time, and particularly during the communication process, when the only communication we have is through email or instant messaging or text messaging, that kind of thing. And even video calls, while better than phone calls and emails in terms of addressing some of the negativity we can assume when we don't see a person's face or hear their tone, even video calls aren't nearly as rich and as good as face-to-face communication. So when we can't see a person's face clearly, or we can't read their tone well, or we have what's known as asynchronous communication across time zones or at different times, where messages are left rather than having an opportunity to have real-time dynamic feedback, that kind of thing. When we can't see or don't understand the other person's context, meaning are they in a hurry? Are they walking down the hallway, moving from one meeting to the next as they respond? Are they moving through an airport terminal trying to get an answer to you as quickly as possible? Are they pressed by other demands on their time, and so they're kind of in a hurry to get an answer to you and they answer quickly? Any of these kinds of things can lead to short answers without much context, email or text or instant message communication that is brief and maybe really to the point so that it has a kind of a feel of being aggressive or negative, that kind of thing. When we don't have full and complete information about what's going on for a person, what their intent is, what their situation is, how they're feeling or thinking at the moment, all of these different dynamics of communication, it's really easy to fill in those gaps with negative assumptions. So this week's episode, Consider Alternate Stories, is a reminder to consider alternate explanations, alternate stories, alternate interpretations when you feel compelled to assume the negative. Now, this is actually an application of something I've talked about previously, and if I remember correctly, I actually have a specific episode about this. It's the idea of assuming benign intent. Now, over time, I've had conversations with people, and we've talked about the idea of, do we really want to assume benign intent, or would it be better to assume positive intent? So benign intent isn't going as far as assuming person meant well. We just assume they didn't mean ill. So a benign intent is sort of a neutral assumption. I'm not assuming they intended my well-being or intended good for me. I'm just refusing to assume they meant ill or bad to me. They didn't mean to attack me, even if I perceived it that way. So benign intent is short of positive intent. From a communication perspective, I would say if you can get yourself to assume positive intent, that's even better. And I gotta let you know that I started using the phrase benign intent because I had so many conversations with people who either could not or would not go so far as assuming positive intent. So I was looking for a way to phrase it in a way that was at least not negative. And the kind of situations where I've seen people have a hard time assuming positive intent would be, phrases that I hear are like this. Well, I just have too much history with this person to assume they have positive intent. Or I've seen this situation too many times before to assume a positive motivation on the other person's part. And you get the idea. I would prefer, or I'd recommend, that you find a way to assume positive intent if you can. And if you just can't get there, let's at least assume benign intent. Which gets us to the topic of today, consider alternate stories. One way to get there is to force myself, or for you to force yourself, to consider some explanation for the answer in front of us, for the response we have, for the tone if we're face-to-face with the person, for the way an email is written if we're not face-to-face, to consider some alternate story other than the one that includes somehow they were trying to hurt us, trying to attack us, trying to criticize us, or they were disrespectful, or any number of other negative interpretations. We want to find ways to explain the situation so that we can presume at least benign, preferably positive intent. Now, I've also had enough conversations with people to know that there's a common perspective. Again, not true for everyone, true for enough people that I feel like I need to say something about it. There is a perception that we need to find the right interpretation, and maybe the negative interpretation is the right interpretation. So I got to say that considering alternate stories, assuming benign intent, or even assuming positive intent, is less about finding the right or correct interpretation or story to tell about this other person's motivations or intent. It's less about that than it is about stopping your brain from going into fight or flight response because you feel threatened. It's really about controlling that subconscious automatic process that happens in our mind that pushes us in a direction to have the fight or flight response, which typically will lead to becoming angry. And then because we're angry, responding in a way that makes the situation worse. Really, the idea of considering alternate stories, assuming benign intent, even going so far as assuming positive intent, is less about finding the right story than it is about finding the story that allows you to respond in a way to elevate the conversation rather than escalate the conversation. Because even if the other person meant you ill, or meant to attack, or meant to be critical, your response to that in an escalatory way probably isn't going to help the situation. Considering alternate stories is about finding a way to respond in a way that helps the conversation rather than hurts the conversation, that elevates the communication rather than escalates the situation. So for this week, my reminder to you is when you run into these situations, you get the email that doesn't make sense to you, you receive the email that feels like an attack, you hear a tone in somebody's voice that sounds negative or aggressive, look for ways to consider alternate ways of explaining it. Maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe they're stressed and it has nothing to do with you. Maybe they're frustrated because of the situation, not directly at you. Maybe they have information you don't have. Maybe you did something to irritate them. Consider alternate stories that allow you to stay in control of your response so that you can elevate the conversation rather than escalate the situation. If you can consciously consider alternate stories, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.